So, welcome back to Sex Talk with Natasha. It is Friday night, not our typical Wednesday night. Again, I feel like our rescheduling over the last 3 weeks is just an indication of going back to school germs. Can I? I mean, I've been sick. Several of our potential guests have been ill. We've had to do a lot of scrambling. Yeah, all the kiddos getting back together and sharing germs together and then sharing with us because, we teach them to share so that, what do you expect? It's lovely. So thank you, everybody, for your patience with our scheduling. And, hopefully, obviously, it's not super important that you watch us live. I mean, it's lovely when you do because you can interact with us. But these Facebook Lives are available really kind of, I think, forever. Is this like the universal stamp of Facebook Live? It's just available for whenever you have time to look at them. You just miss out on the interactive part in the process. So that's the only negative. And also we have, I think, some YouTube channel ways that you can also kind of keep up with things that you may have missed. As well as, obviously, if you're a subscriber, you can go back and look at the entirety of all shows at any time. And Ashley, who's the producer of this program, has done a really good job on the Sex Talk with Natasha.com page of archiving everything. So it's super easy to know what topics we've covered, what you might want to go back and look at, and see the whole show. And so I hope that some of you are taking advantage of that benefit. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about shifting attitudes and beliefs and values and all kinds of things that I want to hear a little bit more from our guest. I'm guessing she has some questions on what happens with the normal process of when we become more self-aware as life goes on and we have more experience and more ability to have hindsight and be able to go, so why do I think the things I think about sex? Or what kinds of things have influenced me when it comes to my thoughts about sexuality, etc. What do you do with that information? I'm guessing that's kind of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today, but I want to hear more from her before I just start shooting out bullet pointed info. As far as the Sex Talk show, I'm going to give Ashley a little bit of time to just cover what we're doing, but I just want to give a little bit of an explanation of what we're trying to do on this resource, and that is to offer comprehensive sexual education for adults in a fun, informative, and kind of matter-of-fact way. So this is Sex Talk with me. I'm a certified sex therapist and have been for about, almost, I think I'm going on 7 or 8 years. I need to look that up as far as how long I've been certified. And I'm becoming a supervisor of sex therapy and just really involved and love learning. And I'm always learning more about sex, even though I've spent a lot of time already learning about it. So I'm always amazed at all this new information that's available. And so giving that to the public in a way that is hopefully not overwhelming, and that's little by little, and also ways that can be helpful to you in your life, is a huge part of what the goals here at Sex Talk with Natasha are about. And we do that through these Facebook Live events, through weekly kind of Q&As, through a lot of resources that we share on the Patreon subscription page. And so we're wanting to have fun with this format. So Ashley, you want to share a little bit more about what people can expect?
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you first, everybody, for joining. And for those that are just starting with the program, basically we do a weekly live Q&A, and we do it for 1 hour every week. Usually we do it on Wednesdays. Sometimes we do it on Fridays, just because of, like Natasha said, the kindness of our children getting us sick, and other reasons too, of course. But anyway, so it's an hour, and the way it's split is we do about the first 15 to 20 minutes. Natasha generally gives us a little bit of education on the topic, and then the next 20 minutes or so we bring a guest on, and the guest and Natasha the guest is able to ask questions to Natasha, share their experiences, and really get the perspective of an actual certified sex therapist. And then we like to leave the last 10 minutes or so open for audience questions, your questions. So please go ahead and send us all of your questions. We'll definitely get to them. And then the first 30 minutes are always free on Facebook, generally through Natasha's page if it's live, and then we always go back and repost it on our Facebook page. But the entire episode is always accessible on Patreon. So head over to patreon.com/Sex Talk with Natasha, become a patron. You can have access to everything. And like Natasha said, you get a whole bunch of great benefits by being a patron. And you want to just say, if you do want to see Natasha professionally, you can check out her online practice. It's called Symmetry Solutions, and you can find that at symmetrysouls.com. Now I'll turn it back over to Natasha.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Ashley. Appreciate it. I also just want to give an invitation. We are looking for guests to come on the show. I love spending an hour with whoever wants to spend an hour with me. So you don't have to be a patron to be a guest on the show. And you can really ask about anything. You can also come on as a professional if you feel like you have some level of expertise that you'd like to share, or just from a personal, professional perspective. In other words, like, this is something I'm really into and have a lot of experience with from a personal perspective, and I'd like to just kind of maybe have a conversation with Natasha about that. I also always love people also who want to bring a different perspective than I offer. So if you disagree with something I've said, or maybe you don't think I've hit a topic correctly, or maybe I'm not hitting on topics that you feel are applicable to your particular lifestyle situation, give us a try. I'd love to have a conversation. So that's what this is all about. All right, so let's dive in. So Rebecca, tell us a little bit about kind of what brings you to the show tonight. What is your kind of question about what's going on in your life that makes you think, maybe I'm reevaluating a few things, and how do I go about doing that?
Right. Well, I know it's kind of a massive and all-encompassing question that I've posed, but over the last 2 years, I've made some major personal shifts in my belief system, and I've had to reevaluate basically the way I view everything. And I've realized that it's opened a huge door for me personally, as far as my personal sexuality and interests, as well as, how that impacts my marriage and even how I view others and their sexuality. Whereas before I, may have been much more closed-minded, I have a much more broad view. And I've realized that, sometimes that's very difficult. And there are some negative aspects of making such a huge shift as I try to find my personal balance. But then also, there are some amazing and wonderful things that have happened, for me personally, and also in my relationship with my spouse.
And so are you talking specifically about a religious shift when you say beliefs? So like that you have shifted away from a religious background?
For me, one of my biggest shifts has been religiously, but also even societal norms. That's come into play a lot, because I've got a lot of friends who have open relationships, non-monogamous relationships, and who identify all across the gender and sexual spectrum. And I've realized that for me, there's a lot more possibility there than I ever expected. And so it's been great, but also a little shocking at the same time. So.
Okay, so kind of this idea that I think we're always kind of going through a little bit of a sexual revolution of the times. When you look at historically, a lot of different ideas have been challenged all along the way. And I think we're definitely going through something like that, particularly in the LGBTQ plus range. Same-sex marriage obviously has been a big thing in the news, all the understanding about transgender rights and, the bathroom issues that we've dealt with in this country. So there's definitely a lot going on. The fads of non-monogamy becoming more talked about, not as taboo, not as secret as maybe before, although I think it's still a fairly underground thing.
Yeah.
50 Shades of Grey, you know, brought about kind of the kink revolution in the sense of at least us talking about it. It's been it's been around for a long time, way before 50 Shades.
Yes.
But at least kind of more dialogue in the mainstream culture, right? So yeah, so we're seeing a lot of even, you know, conversation about reproductive rights. I mean, there's a lot. So whether it's religious or political or societal, I think that's kind of what you're talking about, is that that's a lot of information to be processing in a different way than maybe you grew up thinking you would be processing those things.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about when you say, so there's been both negative and positive ramifications from these shifts? Can you talk a little bit about like what's the negative or scary or confusing parts of that? And what are the positive liberating parts?
Some of that is just a shift in community. You know, I had a religious community that thinks a certain way, and suddenly I have a very different view. And so there are some conflicts there, some things where we used to have very open dialogue that some people are not as willing to have the dialogue about. You know, that's for me personally. I've seen friends where they've made a similar shift and family kind of writes them off. And then also, you know, politically, it becomes a huge debate. If you post something online, you know, if you're standing up for, you know, the whole bathroom issue that came up, that was huge. And sometimes that costs you friendship, and sometimes you have a chance to make somebody think in a different way. So, you know, I mean, that's kind of a mix of the positive and negative, but yeah, I mean, it's just, it strains on some, you know, friendships and relationships. And then personally, you know, being able to accept myself and, you know, a new view of myself and possibilities can be really difficult sometimes to get some of that same rhetoric that's in my mind and has been so built in me from, you know, my social networks and my former religious community. You know, it's hard to get that out of there, I guess, that little bit that just sits in your brain of how you've always looked at things. But then the freedom that I felt is huge. And being able to have, for me, it's been a more intimate relationship with my spouse. I always thought we had a great intimate relationship, but having a more open dialogue and being able to see each other more completely than we had previously, and to be able to give each other more space, that's been huge, and it's been great.
So I'm guessing there's possibilities that maybe neither one of you would have considered before. And not that meant that your sex life was bad before, but that now that there's like a new way of even looking at it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what questions do you have in particular for me?
Well, I guess if we go from my personal experience, like, what are some ways that you can, like, that I could work on kind of shutting down those old voices, I guess, that with a new perspective and a new appreciation for myself, you know, are there some tools or suggestions that you might have?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think this is fairly on point with some of the bullets that I have come up with. So I'm going to share some of those. Ashley, give me a quick, where are we at with time?
Oh, we're at your time, 10:15.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I'd like to just start off with that I think is helpful for people to kind of look at this perspective. First of all, when do these shifts tend to happen? A very typical time that these shifts tend to happen are during developmental shifts in your life. Okay, so one might be, for example, midlife, like the midlife crisis type of moment, you know, where a lot of people, that's kind of the task that you're developmentally going through, is re-looking at, where do I come from? What have I been a part of? What I want to continue? Those are kind of normal things to be going through. There can be other developmental phases too, like becoming a parent or anytime you hit a new decade in your life, you know, so when you turn 30 or 40 or 50, those are all developmental times when you might be more apt to be self-aware in these ways. And what I want to just kind of be thinking about as part of this first bullet point is that I think a lot of acceptance that identity formation is not an individual process, right? So I think a lot of us are like, oh my goodness, I was raised Catholic or Jewish or Democratic or Republican or by hoarders or by, you know, whatever types of things that we were raised by. And my life has been ruined, you know, and I've been like, you know, so affected by this system that imposed itself on my individuality. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. That is correct. Because none of us were born as little islands that could take care of ourselves and, you know, look at the world around us from, you know, age 6 months old and go, I think I'm going to be willing to accept this type of thought process. We are highly, highly influenced by our systems, particularly the ones we grow up in. And that's normal. And whatever those things are, and I really encourage people to look at the many different ways that they were influenced. So racial influences, cultural influences, religious influences, political influences, geographical influences, right? So, I mean, ethnic influences. I mean, there's like so many ways that you can be attaining messages really from a very early age. And you know, the studies on brain development are just fascinating. You know, how many messages even babies are taking in, you know, on a daily basis, depending on their environment. So can we all just take a step back for a second and just kind of take a deep breath and just be like, you know what? Yeah. So many of these things affected my identity, affected how I thought about myself, affected how I thought about sexuality, affected my values and my morals and my ethics around some of these issues, and whether or not I stood on this particular issue in a certain way, or whether or not I believed a certain thing about sexuality. So self-acceptance, I think, is a nice place to start. And then the second piece that I would say that I see a lot of people doing when they're going through these kinds of shifts is that they start the regret machine, which is the what ifs. Well, what if I hadn't been raised, you know, in this particular setting? What if I had had more autonomy or authenticity? These are kind of like very nice words. But again, I'm not sure exactly what they mean to people sometimes, right? Because I don't know how anybody grows up perfectly authentic or perfectly autonomous when we're part of systems. And, you know, but what if I would have been able to maybe have more or less sexual experiences before my primary partnership? What if I would have not had these belief systems about gender roles and, you know, how I came to be a man or a woman in a particular sexual way, and what was imposed on me as far as what was the correct way to be a man or a woman? What if I would have been able to feel less sexual shame, right? Or what if I would have given more concepts about sexual responsibility, or, you know, I mean, the list is far and wide. And so I just really encourage people to try to put their wide sweeping brushes down, right? So let's not make wide sweeping assumptions about the what ifs, like you have some type of crystal ball where you can look and see that your life would have been so much better and so much more sexually positive or healthy if certain things would have been in place. Maybe, we don't know, right? We don't know. And there's usually both positives and negatives about most upbringings. There's usually things that you would have had to challenge regardless of the upbringing you would have come from, because like I say often in this show, the sexual myths and misconceptions has been a very old human story, right? And I don't know any culture or religion or people that don't deal with that at some level. And so I think that there's a better way of framing it, more instead of from a sexual regret perspective. It's like, here's all this data and information. And now I can decide, where do I go from here with that? So this gets to my number 3 bullet point, which is, what do I have current control over? And so what types of self-awareness issues am I coming across? What types of shifts am I facing? I just recently wrote a book called Check Your Baggage, which is kind of all about this particular thing. And so it kind of goes through a lot of different typical messages that we may have received, especially here in the United States, that most people, or many people, kind of have had those messages impact their sense of self or their sense of sexuality. And so kind of just encouraging people to be aware of those things, and then figuring out, well, so what, I don't necessarily have control of the past, or of those things having been taught to me, or those things having been part of my culture or my upbringing, but I do have maybe possibly some control about what I want to do with that information going forward. So becoming somewhat solution focused about it, having some strategies in place for helping you figure that out. And for me, strategies are multifaceted. And I want people to kind of think about all the different parts of themselves to face a new perspective. So one is intellectual, and we're all fairly good at that in this country. We're all fairly good at the intellectual things. Oh, the aha moments, oh, I can think about it differently. But that doesn't necessarily translate when you're in bed with your husband having sex, and in a more experiential, body-centric way. In fact, you may notice that you have some intrusive thoughts, or your body doesn't respond the way you'd hoped, or these things still have an impact on you in some way or shape or form. So learning how to work with your body as a tool. So where you maybe do breathing exercises, or where you notice the mindfulness exercises. Sensate focus is a big part of this, which I've mentioned before. And not only just, it's not mind and body, but it's also emotion, so what do you notice about your feelings, and how do you communicate your feelings, and what feelings do you allow to inform you? What feelings do you shut down or try not to have inform you? And even maybe a spiritual component, whatever people want that to mean. So something outside of me, like, how does the energy of this room, or the universe, or God, or whatever that is for you, how does something outside of just what's happening in my own physiology also affect what's going on for me? So when you think about like mind, body, emotion, spirit, those are kind of 4 quadrants. That's nice to think about this from that perspective. How does each quadrant inform you differently, if that makes sense? The other point I would make is kind of being, so this is number 4 point, is kind of being aware of your values. And I think I've mentioned this on the show before, where a lot of times, especially when it comes to sex, we think of values as a to-do list or a not to-do list, like don't have sex before you're married, or don't have an abortion, or don't use if you're transgender, don't use the bathroom that you're not supposed to use, right? Or that we've decided you're supposed to use. And so it becomes kind of this list of rules. And instead of really like, what do I value? What do I really want my sexual life to look like? And is it really about the who I'm sleeping with at what particular time? Or is it more about the experience I want to create for myself and partners, or the primary partner that is going to share this experience with me? So what values do I have from an individual perspective, where I self-protect and self-advocate and and have self-pleasure, and also looking at it from this relational component, if you're doing more than just solo sex, which is, how do I look at this other person's needs, this other person's wants? And now all of a sudden there's a lot of potential there for some really interesting values that can look really different for people. Now, I've talked oftentimes about what I would say the foundational kind of 6 principles of sexual health that we've talked about on this show often, which is consent, non-exploitation, protection from unwanted pregnancy or STIs, honesty, shared values, and mutual pleasure. But you can add to that, you can add to that. You can even disagree with some of those. So what is that list going to look like for you? And I really, really encourage people to be seeing that as an ongoing process in their lives. It's not something you just do at once. I see this as kind of like a brainstorming list that you cross things out along the way, or you add things, or you think about it differently, because like you've just said, you're in a different place now than you were 10 years ago. And I'm guessing you're going to be in a different place 10 years from now than you are at this particular point in your life, right? And you're going to have other experiences that inform you and have you shift. And I'm constantly shocked, even with myself, at how my values are consistently shaping and shifting in different ways. And it really is humbling, because especially as a professional, wanting to make sure that my values aren't necessarily like imposed on people that I'm treating, especially when they're shifting all the time, right? And so I'm like, holy cow, that's something I really need to watch, because, I want to make sure that I'm not practicing unethically. The last thought I had around this, before I'll make sure you have time to ask more, is looking for themes. And this is, again, where Check Your Baggage book, I brought up a lot of themes that people can look at. It's by no means all inclusive, but it has some typical ones in there. Now, let's take one, for example. Let's take the Madonna whore complex, right? Where women in general in this country and in a lot of Judeo-Christian cultures have been pitted against their own sexuality, right? So your sexuality has a lot to do with humankind's existence. So in other words, and there's even themes of this outside of Judeo, like the classic Pandora's box, right? And Greek mythology and things like that. It's like the woman is responsible for the downfall of mankind, right? And it usually has very sexual overtones. She was either seducing somebody or opening up something that shouldn't have been opened. Imagine what that could be. And and just, just a lot of that idea that you're either a righteous woman, a good woman, a pure woman, which means that your sexuality is very contained and very much boxed into this idea of when and how you're going to have sex. And in fact, we're not even going to draw attention to the fact that you're having sex, because you're a mother usually in this box. Nobody ever talks about how you become a mother, right? And so we're just gonna focus on the birthing and the baby making, but not the sexuality piece of that, right? So that's kind of one box. And then on the other spectrum, you have this, you're a seductress and you're a temptress and you're loose and you obviously must show a lot of cleavage, or you're using your body as an object. And this is, and again, we have a lot of the men are not even in this conversation. Like, we don't even talk about men and how they're responding to these messages, but it's all on the shoulders of women to manage this type of narrative. So that's a pretty heavy message to be dealing with if you're kind of a normal woman. Might want to feel attractive, sexy at times, and might want to feel like a good mother at times, right? And might want to feel like a lot of different things, and yet you're being kind of torn into these two very polarized ways that we've caricatured women. So let's think about it. So let's use that as an example. So you're like, aha, I've had a mental moment. Oh, the Madonna whore complex. I took a class, or I listened to a Facebook Live on it or something. I'm like, oh, I had an aha moment. That's not a great message. Yeah, that kind of sucks. Yeah, I don't want to participate in that anymore. And off you go. And that next night, in bed, you're like, yeah, that didn't have 1 ounce of an impact in my sexual life, because now maybe you start noticing things about yourself. You're like, maybe could this have anything to do with why I like to take a submissive role in my sexuality? Could this potentially have anything to do with the fact that I don't initiate much in my sexuality, or that when and if I do initiate, there's some guilt attached to that, like I'm too strong or too over sexualized, right? Or like, and so you start noticing how this intellectual thought kind of has infiltrated itself in your sexual experiences. So that's kind of another type of self-education. And then, well, what do I do about that? And maybe I hate that that's happening, right? And so you start maybe shifting maybe I'm willing to initiate more now, or maybe I'm willing to take not always such a submissive role, or maybe I'm willing to have a different thought. So those are all positive things. But what I want to make room for, and this is kind of where I'll end before we go on to patron only subscription, is this idea that those shifts may not affect your erotic template. So your erotic template, the things that turn you on. So in other words, if you like being the, oh, woe is me, I'm a submissive sexual one. Oh, take me now, oh husband. And you're thinking, I think that developed from the mother whore complex, and something that I used to find really fun, now I think is really like oppressive of my sexuality. I just want to say, can we possibly make room for both of those things, where your erotic template oftentimes has nothing to do with your values or your political correctness or your ideas about justice in the world. It's just kind of what's turning you on. So I'm gonna go further into that, because I think that's a really important piece, and we'll do that kind of as we move only to subscribers only. But Ashley, do you want to share just a few things before we move on?
Yeah, no, I think that we're going to go ahead and have everybody head over to Patreon if you want to be a subscriber, patreon.com/sextalkwithnatasha. We have more to come for the next half hour or so. We got some good questions already that we're going to read over there. Yeah, and we'll be back next week.
Good, because I can't wait to see what Rebecca has to say. I've seen her nod a few times, so I want to know what that's about.
Exactly.
What resonated and what didn't is what I want to know. All right, everybody, have a great week for Facebook Live, and we'll just keep on going on Patreon. So goodbye, Facebook.
Bye, Facebook.